Welcome to the workshop of Dionysus. My name is Barnaby Brown and I have here a Pydna aulos based on an original buried around about 400 BC in the Greek region of Macedonia. Now, in this video, I'm going to be talking about three things. An ancient Greek musical term, or a set of three musical terms that come under the umbrella puknon. I'm going to be talking about timbral transitions, or changing the colour of the note that you play without changing the pitch. And then I'm going to finish by explaining a new hypothesis, and this is an insight that's come as a direct result of collaborating with an Australian composer. It's brilliant. I've been able to take off my sort of historicist hat and put on my contemporary musician hat, which I like very much. And in fact, for the revival of this ancient Greek instrument and the understanding of ancient evidence concerning Hellenistic and Hellenic, pan-Hellenic music, it's very important not always to be looking at evidence from much later and trying to go back, but to put yourself in the position of people before notation and move forward in time. So that's what I've been doing with Austin. He has, with wonderful curiosity, really wanted to know, what can this instrument do? And what does it do that's different from other instruments? And that has helped me to think in a new way about the aulos. So this is a report of new ideas, new insights that have come to me as a result of this collaboration. Thank you, Austin. It's been a very creative period, and I'm addressing this video primarily to people who are learning the aulos, but really it's for anybody who's interested in this instrument. There are a lot of stakeholders in this revival. You might be a player of the bassoon or the clarinet or the oboe. This is your great-great-great-great-granddaddy of an instrument. And it's exciting just in the last few years to begin to have some sense of how you might approach playing it. Really, it's very, very early days still. But we'd love to have more company. As I say, we're a tiny group. The Workshop of Dionysus, we meet every fortnight by Zoom. People join from all over the world. Everyone is welcome. If there's anything in this video that bothers you, you'd like to find out more about, please just get in touch with us by leaving a comment anywhere on the website, and we'll get back to you. The website is doublepipes.info. This is a double pipe. And we're not just interested in pan-Hellenic double pipes. This instrument goes right the way back to Mesopotamia. There's a lovely silver double pipe from Ur, 2450 BC, thereabouts. And there are plenty of double pipes that survive from ancient Egypt, around about 1100, 1200 BC. This one, 6th century model, possibly made, certainly played in the 5th century BC. And then you get Greco-Roman ones, which survive intact. The Louvre aulos is the most commonly played. But here, I'm focusing on the instrument of pan-Hellenic musical culture in the 6th and 5th century BC. And the first thing to deal with is, what is a puknon? Okay, so recaps off. Let's see if I can demonstrate a puknon. And I'm going to demonstrate two types, a chromatic puknon and an enharmonic puknon. So I'm going to put the low pipe, which is one tone lower, in my left hand, and the high pipe, one tone higher, in my right. And what I'm doing is I'm bending the high pipe there lower. I'm just going to come closer so you can hopefully see that a little better. So just by withdrawing the pipe a little bit from my lip, I can bend the pitch down a whole tone. Now I might be able to get more than a whole tone. If I squeeze the reed a bit sharper to begin with, the reeds are stopping there, so you can't squeeze too hard. There's a sweet point. When the reeds are wetter, you can get a wider pitch window, more breadth to the pitch. There we are. I managed to stretch it to a third. Now, a minor third there. So a minor third, what's that in cents? It's 300 cents in equal temperament. Okay, so let's just notice that without changing the fingering there, I could easily, without trouble, get 200 cents. And wetting the reeds a bit more, I could get 300 cents of pitch bend. Now, pitch bending is great fun. It does, however, require a bit of practicing. So, I'm now going to attempt to play, first of all, the chromatic puknon, and then an enharmonic puknon. And I'm going to do this from that unison. And I always have to think, because of course it's not the same fingering on each pipe. In order to get a unison, the low pipe needs to have fewer fingers on. So I've got 3 fingers on the high pipe and 2 fingers on the low pipe. Now that's a semitone bend going from a major third to a perfect fourth. I'm not changing any fingering here, I'm just doing it by compression on the reed. And what I'm going to try and do is go from a fourth to a major third to a minor third. So there we go. We have what's called hupate, the fourth, to parupate, the major third, to, and I don't yet know my Greek terms, I have to look at my sheet. What's the next note? It is likanos. So, likanos, the licking finger, that's the index finger for the third note. Why is the third note called likanos? Well, I think it comes from a harp where you maybe wouldn't have a finger on the bass string. So you leave the bass string unstopped and you put your fingers on strings 2 and 3. That's my guess. Anyway, likanos is the third note, and we're going to have the minor third. So this is a chromatic puknon, where what I'm doing with my lip is bending by 100 cent, roughly 100 cent steps. There is a chromatic puknon. No change in fingering, but there is a change in compression, and puknon means compression. And the ancient Greek terms, which are first recorded, well, we know them from Aristophanes, so that's towards the end of the 4th century BCE. And he gives us oxypuknon for the high compression, mesopuknon for the mid compression, and barypuknon for the low compression. So I'll do that again. A chromatic puknon going from meser, going down to, on the low pipe, first of all, likanos, the licking finger, then parupate, and then hupate. And hupate means the boss, or the principal. I'm running off. I'm going to have to start with more compression in order to be able to do that. And also wet the reeds a bit more. So, because only with wet reeds do you have that breadth of pitch. So that was comfortably available. A chromatic puknon. Now, the enharmonic puknon is a little bit more refined. Instead of going down to a minor third, and then a major third, and then a pure fourth, I'm going to go straight down to the major third, and then split the difference with a quarter tone. And this is the enharmonic genus that is attributed to the semi-legendary figure of Olympus, a 7th century Phrygian Aulid. So, it has nothing to do with enharmonic in Western music theory. Okay? Just forget anything from recent centuries. We're dealing with the 6th century BCE here, a long, long time ago. And enharmonic means something completely different. It means that instead of having, it refers to the puknon. Instead of being chromatic with semitones, it's enharmonic with quarter tones. So I must remember to wet my reeds. When Aulids were playing, they weren't talking all the time, so the reeds would remain wet. Sorry, that was the chromatic puknon. I'm going to go for the enharmonic. So the first one I want to do, and I have to think it, I have to hear it in my head. I want to try and go straight from a unison to a pure major third. So that was a bit rough. Plenty of opportunity for more practicing and refinement there. But that's basically what puknon means. You have these different types of puknon, basically chromatic with semitones, or enharmonic with quarter tones. Now, I'd like to talk about timbral transitions. And here again we're approaching Aulos music from another perspective, this time an ethnographic perspective. We're going to go to Japan and the tradition of hichiriki. Now this is a wonderful, wonderful instrument that, again, like the aulos, doesn't have mechanisms. And it's not unique to the Japanese hichiriki, this technique of a timbral transition. You get it also in the Chinese guan and Korean piri. It's common to Far Eastern double reed instruments with a deep history. And essentially, what you do is you keep the pitch the same, and the way you get a change of colour is by playing the oxypuknon on the lower fingering and the baripuknon on the higher fingering. Remember how easy it was to get a pitch bend of 200 cents? I managed to get 300 cents. Okay, well 200 means if our holes are, if they were 200 cents a tone apart, it would be easy. In fact, they're less than that because, bless them, the makers of this instrument decided, for reasons that perhaps we understand better now than we did a few years ago, they bored the instrument not according to, let's call it 12 tet, 12 tone equal temperament. That's conventional tuning nowadays and has been really since the 4th century BC. A 12 tone division of the octave. No, they didn't do that. They bored the holes roughly 7 tet. Now, 7-tone equal temperament. Now, I don't like calling it 7-tone equal temperament, nor do I like calling it 7 equal divisions of the octave. You might hear 7 Edo or 12 Edo, 12 equal divisions of the octave. No, I would like to call it 7 Fido, 7 functionally equal divisions of the octave. And in fact, historically, Renaissance and Baroque keyboard temperaments, they are 12 Fido. So 12 functionally equal divisions of the octave. Well, at least they are in the Baroque era. Maybe when you go back to mean tone, you can't quite transpose into all 12 keys, and therefore it's not functionally equal. Okay, it becomes functionally equal when you can modulate, transpose a scale structure from one key to another. That's the advantage of being functionally equal. Now, it's actually quite brilliant. I love it. I am completely devoted to this unmechanized aulos, and I see it as the ultimate refined instrument. This is not something from sort of lower down the social scale. This is the instrument of Athenian gentlemen. Now, and the reason I'm so confident about that is because of how pleasurable it is to practice hearing these intervals and bringing them into tune. It really is a lovely, health-giving thing to do, wholesome activity. So I would highly recommend it if you are interested in music and interested, if it fascinates you at all, then just the practice, the physical practice of tuning intervals, because you've got two. It's a huge advantage. So you're constantly having to harmonise and use your ears. So it's a very enriching activity practising the aulos. Healing, I would say. So I have enjoyed drawing out of Japanese Hichiriki tradition this idea that you would produce a timbre transition, no change of pitch, but a complete change in tone colour. Let's try a few. Now I can't quite get that one. Okay. In order to get that one, I have to slightly adjust where I am on the reed. So these timbral transitions, I suppose I think of it like this. You've got the octave divided into 7, and roughly 7. So you, instead of having tones of 200 cents, you've got tones of between 160 and 180. An average would be 171 cents. Okay, they're not precisely 171. They're thereabouts, and that gives you, if you've got 200 cents of pitch bend on every note, that gives you a bit of overlap, and it's in that area of overlap between each fingering that you can do a timbral transition. Okay. Now, if you find that you can't do a timbral transition between a note, then you just have to recalibrate, a drop, draw out a little bit, or compress a little bit more, And then you find you will be able to do a timbre transition. And perhaps with more flexible reeds that reliably do have a pitch breadth of 300 cents, you'd have no problem. Much easier. You wouldn't hit those limitations. But certainly with these reeds at the moment, these are Rindo Donax reeds made in 2016 by Robin Howell. With these reeds, I can't quite do a timbre transition on any pitch. I have to live within those windows of overlap. Now, the third and final part of this video, the most exciting part. This is an insight that has, I suppose, I've been troubled by ancient Greek musical notation since I first encountered it about 5 years ago. Because, well, there's not a lot of evidence, and it's very, very much later than the period in which it flourished. So the important period when it's kind of bright and vibrant is the 5th century BC. That's when it is really at its most exciting. And then, of course, it gets organised. But we don't have any manuscripts from that period of organisation in the 4th century. We only have Roman era thing, by which time it's quite confused and they're not complete and they're quite contradictory. So I'm going to approach this problematic evidence from the other end, from before any notation, and just wonder, and this is what came out of the collaboration with Austin. And so Austin was delighted by these timbre transitions and wanted to be able to notate them. And I thought, oh my goodness, how are we going to notate this? So I thought, oh, well, let's use these symbols. Maybe that makes sense. These ancient Greek triplets of the instrumental notation, where you have very arcane and mysterious symbols in triplets. In other words, 3 different forms of the same symbol. And to cut to the chase, the hypothesis, and it's a very tentative hypothesis, is that when composers at the end of the 6th century, or perhaps the early 5th century, decided, we want to get this music down on paper, we want to be able to record this, perhaps for a dithyrambic contest, or someone was particularly proud of or pernickety, they wanted it to be a particular way and to record it on paper. And so if they were an Aulos player, which is likely, I suggest that they were perfectly familiar with timbre transitions. It's a lovely thing to do. Switching between 2 different tone colours at the same pitch. You need a way of notating that, because you can't just write the pitch. And obviously, if you take a symbol for the puknon, a chromatic puknon, and you use the letters of the alphabet for the fingers of your hand, then you can just rotate the symbol for like sharps, naturals, and flats. So let me just explain how the triplets of ancient Greek musical notation work. You have, in ancient writing, a very common where you go from left to right, and then you get to the end of the line, and then you go from right to left. And what happens in this ploughing motion, like ploughing a field, is that when you go from right to left, you mirror all the letters. And it's lovely, like Leonardo da Vinci writing backwards. And so the letter forms, they were quite used in the late 6th and 5th century to reversing letter forms. And so this gives a nice way of doing the sharps and your flats. So the lower, the Bari pukna, are the shapes that go from left to right, and the oxy pukna are the letter forms that go from right to left. And in the middle, what do? Well, tie up their hammocks and they lie on their back and face up. So you just rotate the letters so that they're facing up, and you get the Mesopukna, the point of rest in the middle. And that's how I remember it, at least. Now, what symbols would you use? Well, I suggest that, very much like French lute tablature, they use the letters of the alphabet. And in French lute tablature, A is the open string, B is the first fret, C is the second fret, and so on. And in 6th century BC, early 5th century BC Greek musical notation, I hypothesize that they did a very similar thing, and but instead of using the letters of the Greek alphabet, they used the letters of the lingua franca of the Achaemenid Empire. In other words, Aramaic. And so you would have Aleph, Bet, Gamal, Dalet, He, Wow. And I just love the name Wow. Okay, so all fingers on is Wow. I'll go through that again. Aleph, Bet, Gamal, Dalet, He, Wow. And I have no idea if I'm pronouncing those correctly. We don't have a lot of evidence, of strong evidence for Aramaic phonology of the 5th century BC. But what is important is that at that time, it was incredibly influential. Think of it like this. In the 20th century, children in China are learning to play Mozart, Beethoven, Tchaikovsky. Why are they not learning Chinese music? Perhaps it's because of soft power. There's a Western soft power in the 20th century that causes China to look west. Now, I think exactly the same thing was going on, but the other way round, in the 6th century BCE. So Greeks were looking east. And the Achaemenid Empire, heavens, Babylon was the biggest city in the world. It was the first city to reach a population of over 200,000 people. And at its height, which is precisely at this period, late 6th, early 5th century BCE, it reaches its greatest extent, stretching all the way from Macedonia in the west to Pakistan in the east and to Egypt in the south. So we have 5th century papyri written in Aramaic, so we can see what the official scribes across the empire wrote. And so the letter forms for the first 6 letters of the Aramaic alphabet in the 5th century BC look, to my eye at least, reasonably close to the much later evidence we have, Roman era, 3rd century CE manuscripts with tables of ancient Greek instrumental notation. So, this is my hypothesis. Not for the organised system of the 4th century BC, but for the very earliest. And heavens, there would have been lots of competing systems. So this is just one of many historical possibilities. But it's a useful one. And it's important to emphasise that it is a tablature. It's not these Aleph does not denote a pitch, it denotes a fingering. So Aleph on the high pipe is a tone higher than Aleph on the low pipe. And that's very significant because you still find this sort of relative notation in Roman era musical documents. The Aristides scales, for instance, it's very odd that they should write Dorian and Phrygian using exactly the same symbols. I suggest that this goes back to a tablature notation in which you would, in fact, you can almost call the high pipe a Phrygian pipe and the low pipe a Dorian pipe. If you, in the messer fingered like that on the high pipe, and messer fingered like that on the low pipe would give you respectively Phrygian and Dorian, the centre, the focal tone of those two keys. But again, this is all hypothesis. So it's thanks to this collaboration with a composer outside philology, outside archaeology, that perhaps we have a new insight that allows us to understand this fascinating world of ancient Greek musical notation. So thank you, Austin. And if there are any scholars in universities watching this who are more expert than me in Imperial Aramaic script, I would love to hear from you and refine or throw out this hypothesis. I don't know if it's right, but it certainly seems to me a useful one, a practical one, born out of the needs of an aulos player working with a composer. Thank you very much for watching.